Chapter 27. The Expropriation of the Agricultural Population from the Land. In England, serfdom had disappeared in practice by the last part of the 14th century. The immense majority of the population consisted then, and to a still larger extent in the 15th century, of free peasant proprietors, however much the feudal trappings might disguise their absolute ownership. In the larger seigneurial domains, the old bailiff, himself a serf, was displaced by the free farmer. The wage laborers of agriculture were partly peasants, who made use of their leisure time by working on the large estates, and partly an independent special class of wage laborer, relatively and absolutely few in numbers. The latter were also in practice peasants, farming independently for themselves since, in addition to their wages, they were provided with arable land to the extent of 4 or more acres, together with their cottages. Moreover, like the other peasants, they enjoyed the right to exploit the common land, which gave pasture to their cattle and furnished them with timber, firewood, turf, etc. In all countries of Europe, feudal production is characterized by division of the soil amongst the greatest possible number of sub-feudatories. The might of the feudal lord, like that of the sovereign, depended not on the length of his rent roll, but on the number of his subjects, and the latter depended on the number of peasant proprietors. Thus, although the soil of England after the Norman conquest was divided up into gigantic baronies, one of which often included some 900 of the old Anglo-Saxon lordships, it was strewn with small peasant properties, only interspersed here and there with great seigneurial domains. Such conditions, together with the urban prosperity so characteristic of the 15th century, permitted the development of that popular wealth Chancellor Fortescue depicted so eloquently in his In Praise of the Law of England, but they ruled out wealth in the form of capital. The prelude to the revolution that laid the foundation of the capitalist mode of production was played out in the last third of the 15th century and the first few decades of the 16th. A mass of free and unattached proletarians was hurled onto the labor market by the dissolution of the bands of feudal retainers, who, as Sir James Stewart correctly remarked, everywhere uselessly filled house and castle. Although the royal power, itself a product of bourgeois development, forcibly hastened the dissolution of these bands of retainers in its striving for absolute sovereignty, it was by no means the sole cause of it. It was rather that the great feudal lords, in their defiant opposition to the king and parliament, created an incomparably larger proletariat by forcibly driving the peasantry from the land, to which the latter had the same feudal title as the lords themselves, and by usurpation of the common lands. The rapid expansion of wool manufacture in Flanders and the corresponding rise in the price of wool in England provided the direct impulse for these evictions. The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. The new nobility was the child of its time, for which money was the power of all powers. Transformation of arable land into sheepwalks was therefore its slogan. Harrison, in his Description of England, prefixed to Holinshed's Chronicles, describes how the expropriation of small peasants is ruining the country. Quote, "What care our great encroachers? The dwellings of the peasants and the cottages of the laborers were razed to the ground or doomed to decay. If, says Harrison, the old records of Uri Manor be sought, it'll soon appear that in some manor 17, 18, or 20 houses are shrunk, that England was never less furnished with people than at the present. Of cities and towns either utterly decayed or more than a quarter or half diminished, though some one be a little increased here or there, of towns pulled down for sheepwalks, and no more but the lordships now standing in them, I could say somewhat." The complaints of these old chroniclers are always exaggerated, but they faithfully reflect the impression made on contemporaries by the Revolution in the relations of production. A comparison between the writings of Chancellor Fortescue and Thomas More reveals the gulf between the 15th and the 16th centuries. As Thornton rightly says, the English working class was precipitated without any transitional stages from its golden age to its iron age. Legislation shrunk back in the face of this immense change. It did not yet stand at that high level of civilization where the wealth of the nation, i.e. the formation of capital and the reckless exploitation and impoverishment of the mass of the people, figures as the ultima thule of all statecraft, the uttermost limit. In his History of Henry VII, Bacon says this, "Enclosures at the time of 1489 began to be more frequent, whereby arable land, which could not be manured without people and families, was turned into pasture, which was easily rid by a few herdsmen, and tenancies for years, whereupon much of the yeomanry lived, were turned into domains. This bred a decay of people, and by consequence a decay of towns, churches, tithes, and the like. In remedying of this inconvenience, the king's wisdom was admirable, and the parliaments at that time. They took a course to take away depopulating enclosures and depopulating pasturage. An act of Henry VII, in the Parliamentary Session of 1489, Chapter 19, forbade the destruction of all houses of husbandry possessing 20 acres of land. By another act, in the Parliamentary Session of the 25th year of the reign of Henry VIII, this law was renewed. It recites, among other things, that many farms and large flocks of cattle, especially of sheep, are concentrated in the hands of a few men, whereby the rent of land has much risen, and tillage has fallen off, churches and houses have been pulled down, and marvelous numbers of people have been deprived of the means wherewith to maintain themselves and their families. This act therefore ordains the rebuilding of the decayed farmsteads, and fixes a proportion between corn land and pasture land, etc. The same act recites that some owners possess 24,000 sheep, and limits the number to be owned to 2,000. The cries of the people and the legislation, directed for 150 years after Henry VII against the expropriation of the small farmers and peasants, were both equally fruitless. Bacon, without knowing it, reveals to us the secret of their lack of success. The device of King Henry VII, says Bacon in the 29th of his essays, Civil and Moral, was profound and admirable in making farms and houses of husbandry of a standard, that is, maintained with such a proportion of land unto them as may breed a subject to live in convenient plenty and no servile condition, and to keep the plough in the hands of the owners and not mere hirelings. What the capitalist system demanded was the reverse of this, a degraded and almost servile condition of the mass of the people, their transformation into mercenaries, and the transformation of their means of labor into capital. During this transitional period, legislation also strove to retain the 4 acres of land by the cottage of the agricultural wage laborer, and forbade him to take lodgers into his cottage. In the reign of Charles I, in 1627, Roger Crocker of Fontmill was condemned for having built a cottage on the manor of Fontmill without 4 acres of land attached to the same in perpetuity. As late as 1638, in the same reign, a royal commission was appointed to enforce the implementation of the old laws, especially the law referring to the 4 acres of land. Even Cromwell forbade the building of a house within 4 miles of London unless it was endowed with 4 acres of land. As late as the first half of the 18th century, complaint is made if the cottage of the agricultural laborer does not possess an adjunct of 1 or 2 acres of land. Nowadays, the laborer is lucky if it is furnished with a small garden, or if he may rent a few roods of land at a great distance from his cottage. Landlords and farmers, says Dr. Hunter, work here hand in hand. A few acres to the cottage would make the laborers too independent. The process of forcible expropriation of the people received a new and terrible impulse in the 16th century from the Reformation, and the consequent colossal spoliation of church property. The Catholic Church was, at the time of the Reformation, the feudal proprietor of a great part of the soil in England. The dissolution of the monasteries, etc., hurled their inmates into the proletariat. The estates of the church were to a large extent given away to rapacious royal favorites, or sold at a nominal price to speculating farmers and townsmen, who drove out the old established hereditary subtenants in great numbers, and threw their holdings together. The legally guaranteed property of the poorer folk in a part of the church's tithes was quietly confiscated. Quote, "The poor man is everywhere in subjection," cried Queen Elizabeth after a journey through England. In the 43rd year of her reign, it finally proved necessary to recognize pauperism officially by the introduction of the poor rate. The authors of this law seem to have been ashamed to state the grounds for it, for contrary to tradition, it has no preamble whatever. The poor rate was declared perpetual by the parliamentary session of the 16th year of the reign of Charles I, and in fact only in 1834 did it take a new and severe reform. These immediate results of the Reformation were not its most lasting ones. The property of the church formed the religious bulwark of the old conditions of landed property. With its fall, these conditions could no longer maintain their existence. Even in the last few decades of the 17th century, the yeomanry, the class of independent peasants, were more numerous than the class of farmers. They had formed the backbone of Cromwell's strength, and on the admission of Macaulay himself, stood in favorable contrast to the drunken squires and their servants, the country clergy who had to marry their masters' cast-off mistresses. By about 1750, the yeomanry had disappeared, and by the last decade of the 18th century, so had the last trace of the common land of the agricultural laborer. We leave on one side here the purely economic driving forces behind the agricultural revolution. We deal only with the violent means employed. After the restoration of the Stuarts, the landed proprietors carried out, by legal means, an act of usurpation, which was effected everywhere on the continent without any legal formality. They abolished the feudal tenure of land, i.e. they got rid of all its obligations to the state, indemnified the state by imposing taxes on the peasantry and the rest of the people, established for themselves the rights of modern private property in estates to which they had only a feudal title, and finally passed those laws of settlement which had the same effect on the English agricultural laborer, mutatis mutandis, as the Edict of Tartar Boris Godunov had on the Russian peasantry. The Glorious Revolution brought into power, along with William of Orange, the landed and capitalist profit grubbers. They inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale the thefts of state lands which had hitherto been managed more modestly. These estates were given away, sold at ridiculous prices, or even annexed to private estates by direct seizure. All this happened without the slightest observance of legal etiquette. The crown lands thus fraudulently appropriated, together with the stolen church estates, insofar as these were not lost again during the Republican Revolution, form the basis of the present princely domains of the English oligarchy. The bourgeois capitalists favored the operation, with the intention, among other things, of converting the land into a merely commercial commodity, extending the area of large-scale agricultural production, and increasing the supply of free and rightless proletarians driven from their land. Apart from this, the new landed aristocracy was the natural ally of the new bankocracy, of newly hatched high finance, and of the large manufacturers, at that time dependent on protective duties. The English bourgeoisie acted quite as wisely in its own interest as the Swedish burghers, who did the opposite. Hand in hand with the bulwark of their economic strength, the peasantry, they helped the kings in their forcible resumption of crown lands from the oligarchy in the years after 1604 and later on under Charles X and Charles XI. Communal property, which is entirely distinct from the state property we have just been considering, was an old Teutonic institution which lived on under the cover of feudalism. We have seen how its forcible usurpation, generally accompanied by the turning of arable into pasture land, begins at the end of the 15th century and extends into the 16th. But at that time, the process was carried on by means of individual acts of violence against which legislation for 150 years fought in vain. The advance made by the 18th century shows itself in this, that the law itself now becomes the instrument by which the people's land is stolen, although the big farmers made use of their little independent methods as well. The parliamentary form of the robbery is that of the Bills for Enclosure of Commons, in other words, decrees by which the landowners grant themselves the people's land as private property, decrees of expropriation of the people. Sir F.M. Eden refutes his own crafty special pleading, in which he tries to represent communal property as the private property of the great landlords who have taken the place of the feudal lords, when he himself demands a general act of parliament for the enclosure of commons, thereby admitting that a parliamentary coup d'etat is necessary for their transformation into private property, and moreover calls on the legislature to indemnify the expropriated poor. While the place of the independent yeoman was taken by tenants at will, small farmers on yearly leases, a servile rabble dependent on the arbitrary will of the landlords, the systematic theft of communal property was of great assistance, alongside the theft of the state domains, in swelling those large farms which were called in the 18th century capital farms, or merchant farms, and in setting free the agricultural population as a proletariat for the needs of industry. The 18th century, however, did not yet recognize as fully as the 19th the identity between the wealth of the nation and the poverty of the people, hence the very vigorous polemic in the economic literature of that time on the enclosure of commons. From the mass of material that lies before me, I give a few extracts chosen for the strong light they throw in the circumstances of that time. In several parishes of Hertfordshire, writes one indignant person, 24 farms, numbering on the average 50 to 150 acres, have been melted up into 3 farms. In Northamptonshire and Leicestershire, the enclosure of common lands has taken place on a very large scale, and most of the new lordships, resulting from the enclosure, have been turned into pasturage, in consequence of which many lordships have not now 50 acres plowed yearly, in which 1,500 were plowed formerly. The ruins of former dwelling houses, barns, stables, etc. are the sole traces of the former inhabitants. 100 houses and families have in some open field villages dwindled to 8 or 10. The landholders in most parishes that have been enclosed only 15 or 20 years are very few in comparison to the numbers who occupied them in their open field state. It is no uncommon thing for 4 or 5 wealthy graziers to engross a large enclosed lordship which was before in the hands of 20 or 30 farmers, and as many smaller tenants and proprietors. All these are hereby thrown out of their livings with their families and many other families who were chiefly employed and supported by them. It was not only land that lay waste, but often also land that was still under cultivation, being cultivated either in common or held under a definite rent paid to the community, that was annexed by the neighboring landowners under pretext of enclosure. I have here in view enclosures of open fields and lands already improved. It is acknowledged by even the writers in defense of enclosures that these diminished villages increase the monopolies of farms, raise the prices of provisions, and produce depopulation. And even the enclosure of wastelands, as now carried on, bears hard on the poor, by depriving them of a part of their subsistence, and only goes towards increasing farms already too large. Dr. Price says, "When this land gets into the hands of a few great farmers, the consequence must be that the little farmers, previously described by him as a multitude of little proprietors and tenants, who maintain themselves and families by the produce of the ground they occupy, by sheep kept on a common, by poultry, hogs, etc., and who therefore have little occasion to purchase any of the means of subsistence, will be converted into a body of men who earn their subsistence by working for others, and who will be under a necessity of going to market for all they want. There will perhaps be more labor because there will be more compulsion to it. Towns and manufactures will increase because more will be driven to them in quest of places and employment. This is the way in which the engrossing of farms actually operates, and this is the way in which for many years it has actually been operating in this kingdom." He sums up the effect of the enclosures in this way. "Upon the whole, the circumstances of the lower ranks of men are altered in almost every respect for the worse. From little occupiers of land, they are reduced to the state of day laborers and hirelings, and at the same time, their subsistence in that state has become more difficult. In fact, the usurpation of the common lands and the accompanying revolution in agriculture had such an acute effect on the agricultural laborers that even according to Eden, their wages began to fall below the minimum between 1765 and 1780, and to be supplemented by official poor law relief. Their wages, he says, were not more than enough for the absolute necessaries of life." Let us hear for a moment a defender of enclosures and an opponent of Dr. Price. Quote, "Nor is it a consequence that there must be depopulation, because men are not seen wasting their labor in the open field. If, by converting the little farmers into a body of men who must work for others, more labor is produced, it is an advantage which the nation, to which of course the people who have been converted do not belong, should wish for. The produce being greater when their joint labors are employed on one farm, there will be a surplus for manufactures, and by this means manufactures, one of the mines of the nation, will increase in proportion to the quantity of corn produced." The stoical peace of mind with which the political economist regards the most shameless violation of the sacred rights of property and the grossest acts of violence against persons, as soon as they are necessary in order to lay the foundations of the capitalist mode of production, is shown by Sir F.M. Eden, who is, moreover, Tory and philanthropic in his political coloring. The whole series of thefts, outrages, and popular misery that accompanied the forcible expropriation of the people from the last third of the 15th to the end of the 18th century leads him merely to this comfortable concluding reflection. The due proportion between arable land and pasture land had to be established. During the whole of the 14th century and the greater part of the 15th century, there was 1 acre of pasture to 2, 3, and even 4 of arable land. About the middle of the 16th century, the proportion was changed to 2 acres of pasture to 2, later on to 2 acres of pasture to 1 of arable, until at last the just proportion of 3 acres of pasture to 1 of arable land was attained. By the 19th century, the very memory of the connection between the agricultural laborer and communal property had, of course, vanished. To say nothing of more recent times, have the agricultural population received a farthing's compensation for the 3.5 million acres of common land, which between 1801 and 1831 were stolen from them and presented to the landlords by the landlords through the agency of Parliament? The last great process of expropriation from the soil is finally the so-called clearing of the estates, i.e. the sweeping of human beings off them. All the English methods hitherto considered culminated in clearing. As we saw in the description of modern conditions given in a previous chapter, when there are no more independent peasants to get rid of, the clearing of cottages begins, so that agricultural laborers no longer find on the soil they cultivate the necessary space for their own housing. But what clearing of estates really and properly signifies, we learn only in the Highlands of Scotland, the promised land of modern romantic novels. There, the process is distinguished by its systematic character, by the magnitude of the scale on which it is carried out at one blow. In Ireland, landlords have gone as far as sweeping away several villages at once, but in the Highlands, areas as large as German principalities are dealt with, and finally by the peculiar form of property under which the embezzled lands were held. The Highland Celts were organized in clans, each of which was the owner of the land on which it was settled. The representative of the clan, its chief or great man, was only the titular owner of this property, just as the Queen of England is the titular owner of all the national soil. When the English government succeeded in suppressing the intestine wars of these great men and their constant incursions into the lowland plains, the chiefs of the clans by no means gave up their time-honored trade as robbers. They merely changed its form. On their own authority, they transformed their nominal right to the land into a right of private property, and as this came up against resistance on the part of their clansmen, they resolved to drive them out openly and by force. A king of England might as well claim to drive his subjects into the sea, says Professor Newman. This revolution, which began in Scotland after the last rising of the followers of the Pretender, can be followed through its first phases in the writings of Sir James Stewart and James Anderson. In the 18th century, the Gaels were both driven from the land and forbidden to emigrate, with a view to driving them forcibly to Glasgow and other manufacturing towns. As an example of the method used in the 19th century, the clearings made by the Duchess of Sutherland will suffice here. This person, who had been well instructed in economics, resolved, when she had succeeded to the headship of the clan, to undertake a radical economic cure, and to turn the whole county of Sutherland, the population of which had already been reduced to 15,000 by similar processes, into a sheepwalk. Between 1814 and 1820, these 15,000 inhabitants, about 3,000 families, were systematically hunted and rooted out. All their villages were destroyed and burnt. All their fields turned into pasturage. British soldiers enforced this massive evictions and came to blows with the inhabitants. One old woman was burnt to death in the flames of the hut she refused to leave. It was in this manner that this fine lady appropriated 794,000 acres of land which had belonged to the clan from time immemorial. She assigned to the expelled inhabitants some 6,000 acres on the seashore, 2 acres per family. The 6,000 acres had until this time lain waste and brought in no income to their owners. The Duchess, in the nobility of her heart, actually went so far as to let these wastelands at an average rent of 2 shillings 6 per acre to the clansmen, who for centuries had shed their blood for her family. She divided the whole of the stolen land of the clan into 29 huge sheep farms, each inhabited by a single family, for the most part imported English farm servants. By 1825, the 15,000 Gaels had already been replaced by 131,000 sheep. The remnant of the original inhabitants, who had been flung onto the seashore, tried to live by catching fish. They became amphibious, and lived, as an English writer says, half on land and half on water, and withal only half on both. But the splendid Gaels had now to suffer still more bitterly for their romantic mountain idolization of the great men of the clan. The smell of their fish rose to the noses of the great men. They scented some profit in it, and let the seashore to the big London fishmongers. For the second time, the Gaels were driven out. Finally, however, part of the sheepwalks were turned into deer preserves. Everyone knows that there are no true forests in England. The deer in the parks of the great are demure domestic cattle, as fat as London aldermen. Scotland is therefore the last refuge of the noble passion. In the Highlands, reports Summers in 1848, new forests are springing up like mushrooms. Here, on one side of Gaelic, you have the new forest of Glenfeshie, and there, on the other, you have the new forest of Ardverichy. In the same line, you have the Black Mount, an immense waste also recently erected. From east to west, from the neighborhood of Aberdeen to the crags of Oban, you now have a continuous line of forests, while in other parts of the Highlands there are new forests of Loch Arkaig, Glengarry, Glenmoriston, etc. Sheep were introduced into glens which had been the seats of communities of small farmers, and the latter were driven to seek subsistence on coarser and more sterile tracts of soil. Now deer are supplanting sheep, and these are once more dispossessing the small tenants, who will necessarily be driven down upon still coarser land into more grinding penury. Deer forests and the people cannot coexist. One or other of the two must yield. Let the forests be increased in number and extent during the next quarter of a century, as they have been in the last, and the Gaels will perish from the native soil. This movement among the Highland proprietors is with some a matter of ambition, with some love of sport, while others, of a more practical cast, follow the trade in deer with an eye solely to profit. For it is a fact that a mountain range laid out in forest is, in many cases, more profitable to the proprietor than when led as a sheepwalk. The huntsman who wants a deer forest limits his offers by no other calculation than the extent of his purse. Sufferings have been inflicted in the Highlands scarcely less severe than those occasioned by the policy of the Norman kings. Deer have received extended ranges, while men have been hunted within a narrower and still narrower circle. One after one, the liberties of the people have been cloven down, and the oppressions are daily on the increase. The clearance and dispersion of the people is pursued by the proprietors as a settled principle, as an agricultural necessity, just as trees and brushwood are cleared from the waste of America or Australia, and the operation goes on in a quiet, business-like way. The spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the theft of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of ruthless terrorism, all these things were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalist agriculture, incorporated the soil into capital, and created for the urban industries the necessary supplies of free and rightless proletarians.